Digby, thank you so much for coming. It's such a pleasure to see you again and to have you here. For those who might not have crossed paths with you before or experienced, any of your talks before, how would you introduce yourself?
Um, well, I normally only ever say my name. So that's Digby Tantam.
Okay. Why do you choose to introduce yourself like this?
Because otherwise I'd talk about qualifications or publications or things I've done. It's all a bit irrelevant, really. I mean, presumably you want me to say what I think, and that'll have to be taken on its face value.
Indeed, and so I suppose a great place to start is what would you think about how we can define or understand existential ideas?
Um, well, of course, the term existential has passed into common parlance, and it now means anything that might happen in your life that is out of the ordinary. Typically something challenging or threatening or having to make you think. So that's a bit of a reference to Jasper's work on forget what he called it, but on situations where precisely that you're thrown into a new way of thinking or forced into a new way of thinking. I can remember the date of the book in German, 1919, but I can't remember the term he used. You know what I mean? Limit situations, that's it. So existential ideas in that sense are limit situations. Ideas about limit situations, really. But people use it on the news, don't they? Sort of there's an existential crisis in this person's life or something of that sort. So it's used very broadly, but it's good that people do use the term and it's not restricted to the pejorative way that it was in France in the 1940s after Sartre gave his famous talk and was derided by the Roman Catholic Church in France. And of course, being Sartre, inflamed the situation even more. So things have moved on in that sense. But I wouldn't say I'm an existentialist in any particular way, in the sense that I don't think you have to define yourself in order to think about things well, or carefully at least. Or as a therapist, I feel very at home at NSPC teaching existential ideas such as they are. And I also feel very at home in dilemma, supervising people doing existential therapy. But I don't actually say to myself, oh, they need some existential ideas right now that'll get them out of this jam. I just provide them with my perception of things. And my perception of things is that people come with some hope to a clinic or some expectation or some wish. And you either tell them, sorry, that's completely unrealistic, either reformulate what you want and we can agree on that, or, sorry, but we're not the place for it. And sometimes, of course, we do say that. But particularly when people come and say, I need to manage my son better, please tell me how to do that. I often say that's not something we're into. But when people come, they come embedded or embroiled in a situation. So that situation is either their social situation or their physical situation, or the way they are, or the way they have been in the past. So the way they tend to think or how they react to, with feeling and so on. So everybody comes with a hope, but in some way it's, again, this is a Sartrean idea, as you all know. they faced with their own facticity, so their own social, as I say, social situation. For Sartre, it was the social situation that was particularly galling, the look of the other, the idea there was somebody sitting on his shoulder. And if you've read Words, you'll know why that was, but in his life. But he had the idea that somehow we're not utterly bound by that, and that's another interesting existentialist idea, French idea. Camus had a certain similarity, and de Beauvoir, and to some degree, I suppose, Merleau-Ponty, but I don't think he was that interested in that really. But it's hard to follow why they should have believed that. But obviously, freedom, being free, making choices freely is an important idea. And I think what's free about your choices is that you have to accept their consequences, that you, in that sense, you're the author of your choices. So you're free in that way. And I suppose, as you know, the literary notion, the idea one writes one's life, to some degree you can invent yourself in your writing. That's an important model for both de Beauvoir, who wrote several novels and won the Prix Goncourt for the Mandarins, and Sartre, who got all his money from his literary work. Yeah, and of course Camus also wrote short novels of a philosophical nature. I don't think Merleau-Ponty did. He was very didactic, a bit like me, got a bit bogged down with academic ideas. But yes. So, yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, you distinguished there between existential, and then you kind of corrected yourself and you said existentialist. So can you talk about the difference between kind of existential and existentialist and existentialism?
Well, I use the term existentialist because Emmy would like me to, that being Emmy van Derzen, if any of your listeners have been living in a cave for the last 20 years, but because Sartre's ideas were repudiated by Heidegger, he repudiated most people's ideas, I think, along the way, except unless they were Japanese, when he was very open. So I say that to distinguish this French school, which, as you know, was after Sartre died, or as he got very ill, and then de Beauvoir wrote a lot about him, and then about herself. These ideas were derided by Americans in American culture because they were thought to be immoral. And the idea of freedom was thought to be just an excuse to do bad things or immoral things. So it took a big dip. And then Sartre, to some degree, hasn't recovered from that, but de Beauvoir has, as I'm sure you know too, been reinvented as the philosopher who inspired Sartre and had his best ideas before he did, which may or may not be true. I don't think a reading of their work entirely justifies that, but it's all down to what happened in 1938 and who finished the book they were writing first. And of course, you know, actually the Germanic approach is really applied phenomenology. And I think it's the phenomenology side of things that is really the fundamental idea behind existentialism. And the phenomenology idea is, as again, I'm sure you know, comes from Husserl, but he was strongly influenced by Brentano, who influenced an awful lot of people. And Husserl's idea was that there was something about the world that we don't normally see, and that if you can go through a rigorous exercise that a lot of people say looks a bit like Buddhist meditation, but he called reduction, you start to see things that otherwise you hadn't seen. Now, his problem, of course, is what are you seeing? Are you seeing something your brain is inventing? Or are you seeing something that's true? It's obviously not true trees. That's sort of a joke for Sartre, but it is true perhaps of knowledge and perception. And that's, of course, something that Merleau-Ponty explored in a very, a combination of prosaicism and ordinary kind of observations, and yet deep penetration. So there's something that, in the phenomenology of perception, there are lots and lots of ideas that explore this idea of the reduction. But as you know, I'm sure, because it's Husserl 101, he got lost in it, trying to understand in the epistemology. So what does it mean if you have this noema, this inner perception of something? Does it actually say anything about the real world? Or, as I say, is it just about the way you think? Is it about language? Is it about the inner language that you use? He himself vacillated, I think, about it. The word noema is a bit of a sad word anyway, because it means puzzle. So when it was used by medieval philosophers, they meant something that you couldn't easily understand. They deliberately put roadblocks in your way to deepen your understanding. So it seems like Husserl gave himself a roadblock as a concept. And then he got this idea from Kant that it was a transcendent reality. But, how real is transcendence? Kant had these ideas about time and space and so on, that's fine. Husserl was a mathematician and originally was interested in number. So maybe the idea of one or two is transcendental. But you're stuck when you say that, as a psychotherapist, for example, I can grasp you, and I've done this deep meditative reduction process, and what I say therefore must be true, because it's a transcendental reality. Or Plato, who imagines that you're sitting in your cave, but if you work really hard, you can just about see outside it, and what you see is how the world really is. Well, I think Plato was wrong about ideas and all these other things. Personally, don't really like Plato much, actually. But then I haven't read enough Plato to be really sure. I've been reading and rereading the Symposium, which I don't know, classical philosophers rave about, as you probably know. So I don't really see why they rave quite so much about it. But there you go, I'm probably ignorant. So phenomenology has been a very important influence. And I would say, if anything, my approach is more phenomenological than existential. As you know, Heidegger rejected transcendentalism and went off into ontology, into his own world, basically. And you either buy that or you don't, I think, really, ultimately, with Heidegger. And he himself repudiated being in time. So who knows where he stood at the end of his life. And I can't follow the Zollikon seminars, as in terms of education for young. The thread I'm most interested in lots of ways is sometimes called the Munich School of Phenomenology, of which the two exponents that I read most of are Max Scheler and Edith Stein. And I'm very interested in Edith Stein's work. I think it's fascinating that somebody should become a patron saint of Europe, having started out as a research assistant in a philosophy department. So that's interesting. But the bit that they put in is that there is a direct connection between people. They deal with a solipsism that Husserl had a problem with, on the basis there are direct brain-to-brain connections in the sense that, and this has become quite a standard idea now, really, although people ignore it as if it's not very important, but it is really well upheld. And so that's kind of interesting how we know about other people through our connection with them, through our mutual gaze and our emulation of their facial expressions and so on. So I've written a book about that, which probably nobody would say was existential, but for me, it is a kind of answer to a number of these problems about solipsism and knowledge of other people. And it was for Stein, who actually influenced Husserl eventually. He actually quoted her, having blocked her career effectively when she was a younger philosopher, because she was a woman. Although actually, this is complete irrelevance. So this is the sort of way I shoot myself in the foot. But his university had actually appointed a female professor in 1910. She was a professor of mathematics. So there was no reason to have blocked Edith Stein's career. There was a precedent for giving her for a tenured post, but he did block it. And Shaler influenced her work, but I don't think anybody quite got on with him. He kept marrying younger and younger women, and people disapproved. So yes, so phenomenology, and especially the Munich school, I would say, is my take on what existentialism means for me. But of course, there's this other issue of meaning, which people seem to think is very important to existential ideas or phenomenological ideas. And of course, for me, meaning, I wrote a book about that too, is about a feeling that you mean something to people principally. I mean, I suppose you could say you mean something to your dog, and that would be a kind of meaning for your life. But I think for most of us, the meaning has to come from meaning something to other people. And for most of us, that's about doing something that other people value, and it's good. So that all these ideas of living well and meaning are connected, I think. But the interconnectedness with people and with knowledge, of course. So that's important too. And of course, losing meaning is a horrific experience. It goes with depression, goes with anxiety probably too, and that's a fairly common thing for people to present to our clinics with, isn't it? That they feel they've lost the meaning of their own lives. And that's a part of limit situations too. That's what happens in a limit situation. You don't anymore see what the meaning of your past life has been, if it comes to this, and you don't see what the point is of carrying on, because what could possibly be the meaning of your life in the future. And so that's a crisis for what Sartre and de Beauvoir both called your project, your sense of the ongoing future of your actions or your ambitions. And of course, it's why Frankl is very important in the history of existential ideas, because he did address that question of meaning. Although it's not clear what he meant by it. I'm thinking in one of his books, he talks about being asked to speak to his barracks in the concentration camp by the barrack leader and telling people what meaning meant. And he said, imagine that your wife or your loved one is with you, looking at, you're nodding, you obviously know this, looking at what you're doing. And they'll know what you've done, and they'll know whether you've done it as courageously as you can. And that's the meaning of your life at the moment. That sooner or later, that'll come back. There'll be an end to this situation. So, but his situation was a bit different. First of all, because he just married just before he went off to the camp, and was deeply in love with his wife, who went off to another camp. He believed that she was still alive, and so he actually imagined she would know what he'd done. And in fact, she'd been killed at that point when he gave this address, I think. But he was also a doctor, and actually was officially a doctor in a number of the camps he was in. So he also had that meaning of life of a task. And, you know, even as a doctor with no equipment, I suppose he could make small changes that mattered to people. So he had a connection that was more than just moving stones about or whatever the ridiculous tasks they were given, laying rails or so. But I think it must have been very hard for him, like for everybody. Yeah. So meaning, freedom, understanding, a special kind of deeper understanding, recognizing one's facticity and being able to find a way out of it or beyond it in a project.
And I'm reminded during this conversation, which I kind of managed to forget about when we've spoken before, of you don't just know the philosophies kind of theoretically, but you really have a funny way of relating to them, and you know how you'll describe certain concepts as sad, and you know I forget how kind of emotionally hilarious you can be with these philosophies which you just know so deeply. But you know how did you get to this place? How did you start getting involved with existential philosophies in the first place?
Well, that was one of your questions that I did, well, the only one of your questions I did prepare. And in 1971, I was a medical student in Uganda, and it was a very dangerous time because Idi Amin was in power and people were getting beaten up. White faces weren't welcome. So some of my friends were much braver than me and much bolder than me and did a lot of partying and things, which there was an awful lot of partying to be done, as I understand it, but I didn't want to do that. So I spent a lot of time in the library in Makerere University. And I read a book by Walter Kaufman called something about an approach to existentialism or an introduction to existentialism, which was a sort of mixed bag of things. And I got really interested at that point. I read Bingswanger on Anna O, for example, and Notes from Underground was included the Dostoevsky short novel, which fascinated me because I couldn't understand it. And, you know, the standard bits from Kierkegaard and people like that. So I just got interested. And I suppose as a doctor, I've always been much more interested in people's life histories than anything. So when I was a house surgeon, I was told off by my boss because my summaries about patients were much too long as far as the medical secretary was concerned, surgical secretary, and she complained to him saying I wrote far too much personal detail about individual patients, and he told me to stop. And the other thing he told me is my operative notes were pathetically short. So instead of saying how many sutures were put in and, you know, how long the operation took and all the other technical details, I said, you know, the spleen was removed, something like that, and that was it. So as a doctor, I was always kind of just fascinated, I suppose, in that way. And then, you know, sort of staggering into autism as a special subject, I was very interested in what we were talking about before, the existential crisis of having to discover, often in your early years, that you were different from other people, that you were living in a human community, but you weren't of that community, you were just in it. And that's kind of the most profound existential crisis, really. Has a lot in common with people who are, recent migrants and so on. And I could kind of relate to that, perhaps, from being in Uganda and other places to some degree. And I could relate to the courage it took to, be given that information at such an early age. And it's such a weird thing, it's not that you're going to die. It's not that, it's not about your IQ. It's not about anything conventional. It's just about being disconnected from other people and nothing much you could do about it. You could avoid being shamed about it or avoid being bullied, or you could kind of accept it in some way because you had some other thing that other people would value, so that they would connect themselves to you because they valued you. But often there was nothing you could do about it. No way forward except a special interest. And that's what a lot of people did. They absorbed themselves in some unusual thing. And that gave them their emotional world. So electricity pylons, I came across that a lot.
And I suppose I've always known you in psychotherapy world, supervision world, and so and indeed you're right. You have this entire medical background behind you. Is it something that you continued? Presumably you didn't just do what your surgeon had said and just stopped doing this interest in the personal, but you continued very much so to get to where you are now and to the circles that I've known you in. But so is your medical gone alongside your introduction into psychotherapy and to
Well, it's been a strange kind of struggle, not struggle, it makes it too difficult. It's been a strange parallelism because I'd, for example, at one stage of my life, I was the consultant in charge of the secure unit. So I go from saying that somebody needed, extra tranquilizer, neuroleptic, to talking to somebody who thought they had autism and wondered whether I agreed or not. So it was an odd kind of, my day was very kind of complicated in that way. And for a long while, there was no real intellectual connection between the two worlds, and except in a way through psychotherapy, which was a kind of mediating thing. So I trained as a group therapist whilst I was in training as a psychiatrist. And I was doing some group therapy, and then was the kind of representative of therapy in later jobs in my trust. So I suppose that was the common ground, behind the autism or behind the psychosis or whatever it is. I was very interested in people who cut themselves for a long while. So behind that, there was this sort of idea of, a person-centered approach, not in the sense of a person-centered approach, but, needing to relate to the person in that different and very unusual situation. It's, a great privilege to be a psychiatrist, really, because, you see things or learn about things that other people just don't. So that's how it's been. I've sort of potted along. I dropped out of the acute psychiatry world quite a while ago now, so I haven't prescribed anything for anybody for, I can't remember when. I last section somebody in, I do remember this was in 2000 and, gosh, it must have been, oh, I don't even remember that now, but it was, yeah. So I haven't done anything purely medical, and I can't anymore because I've given up my license to practice this year for the first time, which is a strange business. Yeah. But, you know, I did a bit of forensic psychiatry. I used to see a few murderers and things like that, write court reports, but I'm not allowed to do that anymore because I've given up my license and they won't insure me. So yes, it's been a very mixed career, but one of the problems about that is that people don't know me in any other respect. It's weird. But all these things do, I suppose, come together in this idea of understanding people's project. Why did somebody murder somebody? It's only one person has refused to explain it to me. And I think he was just bemused himself, probably. But yeah, but anyway, that's not really about existentialism, although I think people like Binswanger and even perhaps Boss, I don't know, will have had a very varied career too.
And like you said at the beginning, I think you don't have to. What would your life look like if you labeled yourself as someone that was only interested in existentialism? Like you know, like you were saying, you're at home in the thoughts, in the ideas, in the critical questioning. But that doesn't mean that your only activities, your only engagement with life is in existentialism.
No, that's true. But you make a very interesting point earlier on. I am very interested in people's lives, in how they relate to their ideas. So, you know, it's like I said before, it's a great interest to me that Edith Stein was the daughter of a Jewish daughter of a timber merchant, and somehow ended up becoming a significant philosopher in her own right. And then somebody who became a nun, a Carmelite, converted, and then became a saint. She was sanctified, well, canonized and sanctified by John Paul II, who wrote his dissertation on Shayla. So he was a secret existentialist as well. And you can see how he took such a different tack in the Roman Catholic Church, you know, such an upheaval. Yeah, so interesting to trace people's lives. And of course, the wonderful thing is with the internet now, you can go down rabbit holes in every direction.
For someone that would like to engage with existential ideas, and of course, New School of Psychotherapy and Counseling, it makes sense that you will promote this, but someone that might not be ready to engage in a full, you know, academic program, how can they get involved with existential ideas, whether that's with book recommendations or otherwise, maybe art, film, music?
Well, if they're particularly interested in therapy, then I would obviously recommend any of Emmy van Derzen's books, but the one that she just recently wrote with Claire, which is very short, was excellent. So I would recommend somebody who's interested in how it applies to therapy to read that. If they're interested philosophically, then I don't know exactly. I mean, Emmy's books are just as good for the philosophy. paradox and passion, probably. But there are a number of, more folksy accounts of existentialism. There's a book called In the Existentialist Cafe. I don't know if you've read that. I think it's very good and very sound. So that might be a starting point. I wouldn't recommend anything I've written as a starting point, because that's not something I've been particularly drawn to, writing starting points. But so I don't know if anything I've written would be worth reading.
But you make a really good point there, that there are different books for different times, and it would be it could put you off if you jumped kind of straight into the deep end without actually understanding the basics, maybe before doing so.
Yes.
Although saying that earlier, you were saying that even the people that are writing the deep end stuff got lost in their own thing. So maybe there is no easy way to go about this.
The trouble, knowledge is something that belongs to a whole community. So I don't think you can read anybody, any one person, and get the idea of the sort of knowledge at that moment. I can't say that Kaufman book was an interesting taster, but it wasn't a synthesis or anything of that sort. And Kaufman was big on Nietzsche, so he naturally focused a bit more on Nietzsche than anybody else, who some people say was an existentialist. So it's really, it's really hard to recommend one book that would give you the whole approach. That's perhaps why you're not sure still exactly what existentialism is, although you've got a doctorate or about to get a doctorate, I hope, because it's an accumulation of ideas. It's an orientation, isn't it? You feel changed by it in some way. You feel you just don't notice the same things you used to notice, or you start to notice things you would have thought are trivial, or you ask yourself questions, like where am I going, and things. And everybody's answer is different, but the fact you're asking questions is what matters, that you've got a sort of existential awareness in a way. So it's hard to, it's a practice as well as a theory, I think. And there are lots of things like that. I mean, where do you go to read about Buddhism 101? Well, somebody might point you to a school, or might say this is, these are the 8 great sayings of Buddha or something, but you're not getting a sense of the whole fabric of Buddhism, because it's just a change in yourself, I imagine. I'm not a Buddhist, but I imagine that's how it feels to people. So anyway, I should have looked that up. I should have given you some recommendations properly. But I think obviously Emma's first book, Existential Psychotherapy and Counselling in Practice, is still a bestseller all these years on. So that's worth reading. A lot of people start with that. But that book with Claire is really good. And she's written her most recent book, which is called, I think, Rising from Crisis. I might be wrong. It just came out a few months ago. That's a very good approach to, that's a very good book about the sort of existential approach to ordinary everyday life and its challenges, with a focus on crisis, which from Jaspers on, there has been that sort of focus. Nice man, but apparently daunting. People who were his research supervisees found him very, very difficult.
Well, Digby, I mean, I know that you have to go now, but it's, as always, an absolute pleasure, not only to hear the theory behind it, but when I speak to you about philosophies, always it feels like the philosopher in a kind of a just in casual everyday way. So it's really, really such a pleasure to speak to you about this. Before we close the interview, was there anything that you wanted to add?
Um, I don't think so, Natalie. Just thank you for giving me the opportunity to ramble on.
It's much appreciated. Thank you so much
Okay,
for your time.
my pleasure. Okay, bye.